The medieval times. What a truly awful era to be alive. With how barbaric and violent things were, it's no surprise the punishments were some of the most creatively horrendous in history. From rats crawling into prisoners' bodies, being crushed by large animals, boiled alive. If you weren't on your best behavior, you'd probably be facing a fate much worse than death itself. Anyone watching have a fear of rodents? If so, then be glad you weren't around in the medieval times. This punishment would be used on a variety of prisoners, and if it wasn't stopped soon enough, they'd surely die. A prisoner would be strapped down to a table, then they'd have a slit cut into their belly. Next, rats would be placed on the victim and covered with a bowl, and on top of the bowl would be burning hot coals. This would cause things to get a little too hot for the rats, who would start getting desperate to escape, and they'd have nowhere to go but down. They'd start gnawing at the victim's stomach, trying to burrow into it. Not only would this be incredibly painful, but disgusting. And horrifying as well. Nasty dungeon rats trying to claw their way into your body. Just horrific. This wasn't just used as a form of punishment either, it was also great for interrogation. I mean, try holding on to information when you have rats tunneling into your bowels. So what would happen if you made counterfeit money back in the day? Well, surely that would just land you some time in the slammer, right? Maybe a big fine. No, you'd be boiled alive. Pretty self-explanatory. You'd be placed in a big pot of hot liquid, water, oil, sometimes even molten lead, and then you'd slowly get cooked alive. This was actually a practice used across different cultures. In the Holy Roman Empire, for example, coin forgers would often find themselves boiled to death. In Britain, King Henry VIII used it for those who'd killed someone using poison. Now, this was brutal as it sounds. The heat would sear through the skin, burning limbs and organs. Sometimes the liquid wasn't even boiling when the person was put in initially, just drawing things out even longer, slowly and slowly boiling to death. For anyone enduring this punishment, death wouldn't come soon enough. The agony was prolonged, and even if they tried to speed it up by submerging their head, it was still a slow and painful end, usually taking hours. Yikes. This one goes out to all you claustrophobics out there. Immurement, which is to build someone into an enclosed space. It's basically live entombment. Immurement has been known to happen all over the world in different periods of time, but this was especially a thing in Christendom during the medieval times. The punishment was used as a form of religious punishment for the worst of crimes. The victim would be placed in a confined area, usually a room or a wall, and then brick or stone would be built around them, sealing them into the area. It was rare for the victim to ever be let out, so they'd slowly die inside the enclosed space. Yeah, this one is pretty much the definition of a make your skin crawl punishment. Anything where you're just trapped inside a small confined space is just the worst to me, like being buried alive. This would be a more drawn out death though. There'd be more air than in a coffin 6 feet underground, but not enough. It would slowly get harder and harder to breathe. On top of that, thirst and starvation would kick in. You'd probably be wishing they'd have put you out of your misery in a more violent but quicker way. Being drawn and quartered was one of the most brutal punishments in the medieval times. First, the person would be tied to a wooden frame or cart and dragged with horses through the streets. This was the drawn part. It was meant to publicly shame and humiliate them, as well as bring them to their final destination, and here's where things got even worse. They'd be hanged by the neck, but not to the point of death. Instead, they'd be cut down while still alive, and now comes the quartered part. Their body would be sliced open, usually at the abdomen, and their entrails would be pulled out. Sometimes these would be burned right in front of them. Finally, their body would be divided into various parts, and each one would be taken to a different place to be displayed as a warning to others. People who'd committed treason were usually the ones who'd have this to look forward to. Take William Wallace, for example, who was punished for leading the fight for Scottish freedom by being drawn by 4 horses, one attached to each limb. Then the rest went pretty much the same way I just outlined. Oh, and this punishment stuck around until the 1800s, if you can believe that. What other punishments could criminals in the medieval times have to look forward to? Well, for killers and thieves, there was being broken on the wheel. This one was pretty blunt, no pun intended. After committing a terrible crime, the criminal would have their limbs tied to the spokes of a large wheel. Then a big dude with a big hammer or blunt object of some kind would show up, and their job was to rain blows on the victim's limbs, one by one, breaking them. In terms of how long this would last, that would depend on the severity of the crime. If the executioner wanted to be merciful, he'd start with lethal blows first. If not, then he'd start with the ankles and work his way up. Sometimes it could take days for the victim to finally die of their injuries, and after all the bones were broken, the victim would often be set on display for a while just to deter other folks from committing the same crime. Crushing punishment. Now, we've discussed a lot of punishments for people who were already deemed guilty, but what about people still awaiting trial? Well, turns out they weren't always just kept in cells. Prisoners who were on the fence about pleading guilty or not guilty to a crime might sometimes need to be coerced. Unlike today, where certain bargains can be made in order to enter a plea, in Europe back in the day, you'd just get crushed. A prisoner would be strapped down, and then heavy objects like stones would be placed on them until they either gave in or died. They'd usually die. And it was pretty gruesome. Their bones would usually break and pierce the skin. This practice was used for a long time too, beginning in the 13th century, lasting all the way up to the 17th. So why would anyone refuse to enter a plea in the first place? Well, this was usually to retain one's property. See, if a prisoner said anything and was found to be guilty, they'd be stripped of their property, leaving their family with nothing. But if they refused to say anything and were executed anyway, their property would still stay in the family, being passed down to their next of kin. Getting crushed by stones is one thing, but how about a big heavy animal, like a 12,000-pound elephant, for example? Let's move out of medieval Europe for a moment and into medieval Southeast Asia. Enemy soldiers, tax evaders, thieves, all could die at the hands, or rather the feet, of an elephant. Usually it would involve the criminal being crushed by the elephant, but at times other methods of death were also used. Some trained elephants with blades fitted to their tusks would be used to slice at the victim. Typically the elephant would just step on the person though, either killing them instantly or drawing things out longer, all dependent on how the executioner wanted to go about it. This form of punishment was used in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and it was used for a long time, as recently as the 19th century. Now, having your head lopped off may seem like a pretty easy way to go compared to most of the stuff we've discussed so far, but that's if you were lucky enough to receive a nice clean cut. Being beheaded by a sword was the preferred way to go. An axe was less efficient, and it was especially bad if you didn't have a very skilled executioner to deliver the blow. There are accounts of people being hacked at multiple times before their head was finally detached from their body, which would have been pretty horrific and excruciating. Overall though, this was seen as a more honorable way to die, as it wasn't supposed to be a drawn out process and was said to be pretty painless. Not that they'd have any way of really knowing that. This was a death usually reserved for knights, nobles, and royals. Beheading was practiced throughout the medieval era and long after it, with the last beheading in England being carried out in 1747. How were violent criminals dealt with in medieval Europe? Well, violently, as we've already discussed, but this particular punishment was reserved for those who attempted to kill someone with a blade, and it kind of plays out like a really twisted game. They take the assailant's hand, lay it down on a table, and then shove the criminal's own blade all the way through their hand, pinning it to the table. Next, the criminal would have to get their hand off the table, but the catch, they weren't allowed to use their free hand to pull the blade out. Imagine trying to unpin your hand from a table with a knife stuck through it, your hand just pressing into the guard, slipping up and down the blade. Yeah, kind of makes you cringe just thinking about it. What would happen to you back in the day if you had a foul mouth? This is where the tongue terror comes in. For those that committed blasphemy or heresy back in the medieval times, a device known as a tongue terror would be used to silence them for good, or at least make it much harder to enunciate. First, their mouth would be forced open, then the device would be clamped onto the tongue with a screw at the back. Not hard to imagine where things go next. Let her rip, This one is pretty barbaric. Not lethal, but you'd probably be wishing it was. So let us know down in the comments which one of these punishments you'd go out with if you had to choose one. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.